Welcome, everyone. My name is Paula Birnbaum, and I'm the Academic Director of the University of San Francisco's MA in Museum Studies program. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this collaboration between our program and the Thacher Gallery. We would like to begin our program with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge our presence on the unceded land of the indigenous Ohlone communities and pay our respects to these traditional caretakers and elders, past, present, and emerging. It is our intention that this acknowledgement plays a role, however infinitesimal, in a much larger process of confronting the past in order to create a not yet realized future rooted in justice. I want to acknowledge the difficult moment in which we are presently living to give context to this evening's talk. Our hearts go out to the family of Breonna Taylor, who, like so many other families, will not see justice done. The entire system of policing and criminal justice steals lives and shatters families. Breonna's story is directly linked to tonight's discussion of inhumane prison sentences for some and no accountability for others. This is a time for all of us to speak up, donate, vote, say her name, share the story of her life, and never forget. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to let you know about the current online exhibition at Thacher Gallery and the remaining programs linked with the exhibition. We'll be sharing links for these throughout the program. Tonight's event will also be recorded and shared on the gallery's YouTube station and website. A Matter of Liberation, artwork from Prison Renaissance, features 6 California artists examining liberation through the lens of incarceration, race, and social justice. It is on view through the gallery's website. Join us on October 15th when the Jesuit Foundation and Thacher Gallery will present A Matter of Liberation, a lecture by writer and organizer James King, discussing alternatives to prisons. On October 29th, the Jesuit Foundation and Thacher Gallery will present Ear Hustle in Conversation, featuring co-creators Earlonne Woods, Nigel Poor, and Antoine Banks Williams. Join us for an inside look at this award-winning podcast from the San Quentin State Prison. USF's Museum Studies program is excited to be sponsoring this event. With a focus on social justice, the 16-month master's program in museum studies invites students to integrate and apply knowledge from a range of disciplines to prepare for a profession in the museum and art worlds. Our next open house is on Thursday, October 8th from 5 to 6. We'd love for you to join us. We are so thrilled to be bringing Sean Kelley, an exemplary museum professional, to all of you tonight. Tonight's event will include a presentation and then ample time for Q&A. Please send in questions throughout the talk. Sean Kelley has run all public programming at Eastern State Penitentiary since 1995, when he was hired as the organization's first full-time employee. He now serves as the Senior Vice President and Director of Interpretation. In this role, he produced the site's award-winning audio tour, which has been heard by more than 1 million visitors. In addition, he has curated more than 100 site-specific artist installations at the site and curated the exhibit Prisons Today, Questions in the Age of Mass Incarceration, which won the 2017 Overall Award for Excellence from the American Alliance of Museums. From 2017 to 19, he oversaw Hidden Lives Illuminated, a project which resulted in 20 original films made by currently incarcerated individuals and projected them for a month onto Eastern State Penitentiary's facade. Mr. Kelley visits active prisons and writes critically about museums and social justice, as well as historic preservation. I was particularly inspired by his latest piece in Museum Magazine entitled "Get Out the Vote," about how museums really can use their authority to dispel misinformation and become forums for civic dialogue. He is dedicated to revealing the negative impact that incarceration and the US prison system has on individuals, communities, and our country. Valuing the stories of experience, he has been a leader in ensuring the voices of incarcerated people are heard within the museum. Thank you so much, Sean, for joining us this evening at a time when we really need to hear your voice, and welcome to the University of San Francisco.
Thank you so much, Paula, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to the university. Thank you for the invitation. Also, thank you, Glory, and Victoria and Nell have been helping set this up. I also want to acknowledge what a difficult day this is. I can literally hear helicopters overhead. I live about 6 blocks from Independence Hall, where there are protests happening right now following the murder of Breonna Taylor. So I hope you don't hear those, but they're a little bit distracting to me, but I think they need to be there. I also just want to acknowledge how much I respect Ear Hustle and the work of Antoine Williams. I'm a huge fan of that show. I assume if you're watching this, you've probably listened to the podcast. It's unbelievable. And on a good day, we share a lot of DNA with our friends at Ear Hustle, trying to bring stories out of these places that are some of the most hidden and inaccessible places in the United States. So on that note, I'm going to get started. Prison museums. I counted this afternoon, I've visited 28 prison museums to date. I didn't think I was going to get into this work with an interest in prison museums, but now that I've been doing it, when I travel, I look for them. If they're nearby, I go visit. So I've seen 28 of them. Most of them are not sites of conscience. This organization was founded by, I believe, 6 organizations, 6 historic sites that try to connect sites of human suffering to contemporary issues, their phrase is memory into action. And so these are places that try to inspire us to change the world around us based on the experiences of suffering in the past. One of those original sites is Perm 36. I've been there it's in Siberia. It's a disturbing place. Most prison museums are not sites of conscience. So this is nearby, or relatively nearby, in St. Petersburg, Russia. You see a lot of mannequins in prison museums. Here's Sinop, Turkey. Closer to home, Moundsville, West Virginia. Again, from Moundsville, here's the real West Virginia electric chair, and then right next to it, they have the reproduction electric chair for your photo op. Mansfield, Ohio. The cell blocks in Mansfield. I believe that is the real Ohio State electric chair next to some props from a movie, but I'm not entirely sure. In St. Augustine, Florida, it's basically a comedy routine. Our guide was basically a stand-up comedian, kept some of the people in the group laughing straight through. There's a student who came to Eastern State Penitentiary from one of the University of California schools about 10 years ago, and he was writing a master's thesis on prison museums, and he said that inevitably they take the perspective of the incarcerated person or of the officer. And at first I rejected his thesis, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought he was right. And so one of the things that's noteworthy is so many of the prison museums are actually run by Department of Corrections or very closely associated with them. This is Colorado State Prison. That's the real prison on the left, the active prison on the left, and the museum on the right. And the tone of their exhibits is absolutely from the officer looking into the cell, encouraging that perspective from visitors as well, including their gas chamber. You can look in but not sit. I guess that's a small win. Missouri State Prison, the guide here was literally an officer during the day and a guide on weekends. Kind of an extraordinary building, and there's people taking their photographs in a real gas chamber. I work at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. We are a site of conscience, and we have not done everything right. I'm going to try to be honest about that. We continue to struggle with some of the issues that our nation is grappling with, but I want to tell you some stories of how we got where we are and where we're going, and certainly welcome your feedback. The building has its own disturbing but thought-provoking history. It was built outside of Philadelphia with a distinctive wagon wheel floor plan that was copied all over the world. So you see it in Mexico and in London, England. We'll see that prison again in a few minutes. Wandsworth again in London. They're still building like this. This is a modern prison built in the United Kingdom. And if you play SimCity and you tell the computer to give your city a prison, it gives you this. So it's still the impact, the legacy of Eastern State's architecture is still with us today. The architecture has always been the easier thing to talk about. The harder thing to talk about is the people who lived there. The building was built with a system of solitary confinement on the belief that people are inherently good and would find penitence if they looked into their hearts in isolation, if they were removed from the distraction of a corrupting society. And so they put every person in solitary confinement for about 100 years. Of course, that was a terrible, terrible failure. About 85,000 men, women, and children were held against their will behind our walls over the course of 142 consecutive years of use. It survived all the way up until 1971. There are still people who are incarcerated in Pennsylvania who serve time at Eastern State. This is Eastern State in the 80s. It was abandoned in 71. This is how it looked in the 80s. And when we took it over for tours in the mid-90s, in 1994, the building had become this really beautiful artifact. It's gorgeous, and it lies to us. It tells us that this is a place of spiritual reflection, a place of beauty. We know that, of course, that was rarely the case, but that is the artifact that we have. We began our tours very simply, just trusting the building to be interesting. We had to give every visitor a hard hat in the early days to even keep them safe. Over time, we've been able to move away from the hard hats, introduced an audio tour in 2003. Today, pre-COVID, we give about 310,000 visits a year, many of them to school children, asking critical questions about what is justice in America today. We've worked with artists almost from the very beginning. I'll tell you about a couple of the artists in the early days, and later I'll talk about some of the more current issues, current pieces that we have. Virgil Marty, that's Oscar Wilde on the left. Philadelphia artist Virgil Marty recognized that Oscar Wilde was incarcerated exactly 100 years before he built his installation in a prison called Reading Jail that was modeled after Eastern State Penitentiary. This is one of those copies, those architectural copies. So to say that Oscar Wilde would have recognized Eastern State Penitentiary as being a familiar space, unfortunately, is an understatement. And so Virgil filled a hallway with these silk lilies. Oscar Wilde was often photographed holding a lily, and then inside the cell he made wallpaper. Oscar Wilde's reported dying words were either this wallpaper goes or I do. He had a lifelong fascination, love-hate relationship with wallpaper. And so Virgil, incidentally, Oscar Wilde was incarcerated for being gay, a conviction that, of course, is morally repugnant to us today. And so the piece really drew this question of who writes these laws. We think they're handed down from above by God, or that they've been with us all the time. But in fact, of course, our laws are a reflection of our society's values. And so Virgil really was drawing attention to this particularly offensive conviction of a man who's become really beloved. So the lower half of the wallpaper is, again, back to the lilies. The top half are sunflowers. And the chair rails quotes from Oscar Wilde touching on the issue. Wickedness is a myth invented by good people to account for the curious attractiveness of others. Our visitors asked wonderful questions, and we had great conversations about the nature of our laws with this piece. This is Elon Sandler's piece called A Rest. Elon's sister was murdered in Toronto in 1995. The person who killed her has never been identified, presumably is still free. Elon interviewed his parents about what it's like to lose a child to murder, and then made doors in one of our cell blocks where the doors had been removed. We think they were sold for scrap metal. Elon put those cells sort of symbolically back into use by sealing them off with words that his parents said to him in this painful conversation about the murder of his sister. I would like to know that the person who did this is dead. This one says, I want to tell family members who did not know Simone about her strength and her goodness. This one says, we want to know why she was singled out. Was she just in the wrong place at the wrong time? This is Nick Casway's piece called Portraits of Inmates in the Death Row Population Sentenced as Juveniles. The portraits are made with a rust inhibitor on plates of steel, and over time the faces would become actually more clear. In the photographs it looks like they're becoming less, but they became more clear over time. And as the people he depicted were executed, he would seal the entire plate so it would stop aging and stop rusting. Nick made this piece in 2006, knowing this case was coming before the Supreme Court, and they did eventually declare that this execution of someone for a crime they committed when they were a child is unconstitutional. And this is a piece that's an older piece, but still on view. This is Bill Cromar's piece called Gitmo. It's a recreation of a Guantanamo Bay cell inside of an Eastern State Penitentiary cell. These thick, opaque stone walls holding this just very thin chain link fence, which is where people were housed in Guantanamo when it was first in use, accurate right down to the arrow pointing to Mecca, spray painted on the floor of those cells. In many ways, the artists that we worked with led the way. We find our way ourselves sometimes reverse engineering, trying to find why artists who have made pieces for our site have been able to connect with visitors in an emotional way, and often in an intellectual way, in a way that we for many years struggled to do. We were good about talking about architecture and struggled enormously to figure out how to make the building speak to visitors and the issues that surround us today. Why aren't we better at addressing contemporary issues was the question we asked for many years. We finally wrote an interpretive plan, which is museum jargon, for a report that in which you decide what you're trying to communicate. In our case, what questions we're hoping to ask, what questions we hoped our visitors would contemplate as they left. And we decided that we were doing pretty well on 5 of the 6 major themes we were trying to touch on, but the theme of contemporary relevance was almost entirely in the voice of artists on our property. And we as an institution were silent about anything that had happened in the American criminal justice system since 1971 when our building closed. And the first thing I did after we finished that report was sit down and start talking to our visitors. I had never really sat down and tried to understand where our visitors were coming from. And museum work you really do have to work back from your audience and say, where are the people coming from? Where are their hearts? Where are their thoughts? And I was surprised to find that our visitors did not find this a political statement to talk about the growth of the American prison system, prison population. It just, our visitors were ready to have that conversation. We weren't, but they were. And we got to work. The first thing we did is built this graph. It's 16 feet tall. It's fire engine red. It sits on the heart of our audio tour and our guided tour routes. The low bar on the graph represents the per capita incarceration rate in 1970 when Eastern State closed. And the high bar is 2010, the last full decade at the time, and it's a per capita rate of incarceration showing this enormous jump in the number of people our country was sending to prison. Because the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world by far, again, this is per capita, it has nothing to do with the size of the population. Because we have such a high rate, we were the highest rate, we could simply list every other nation in the world by their height on the graph, showing their per capita rate of incarceration. So there we are, the United States at the top. We found that many of our visitors asked in the prototype phase of this project, do some nations keep their populations small inside their prisons by simply executing everybody? The answer is no. But we got the question enough that we divided the graph into 2 halves. The half that one side, the left side, is the nations that practice capital punishment. The right side is the nations that do not practice capital punishment. And so here we are, the United States, the world's highest rate of incarceration. There's almost no one in second place. Look at that huge drop until you get to Rwanda. All of our close US allies are about 1/5 of our rate of incarceration. None of them practice capital punishment. And so this is the side of the graph where you see the cell phones come out and people, our visitors mostly have no idea that we are so different than any other Western democracy. And this is where they start asking questions of why is the United States such an outlier among the nations? The north side of the graph depicts the shameful racial disparities in our prison population growing worse in our era of mass incarceration. So here we are in 1970, and again in 2010. One of the messages, one of the takeaways from these statistics are there's more of everybody. There's more white people in prison today as a percentage of overall population. There's more white people. There's more Latinx people. But there are far more Black Americans in prison today. The policies that we passed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, if you're on this Zoom call or you're watching this presentation, this probably is not news to you, but our visitors are often surprised to find that the policies that we passed during those decades have been felt most sharply by Black Americans. So we actually are waiting to build the 2020 bar for our graph. We're waiting for the final statistics to come out from Bureau of Justice. So we'll build that bar next year or the year after we get the final stats. Our nation has dropped its rate of incarceration, but not by much. We're still far and away the highest incarcerator of its citizens. No one else is, again, still close. The graph is part of our audio tour. Every visitor experiences the graph and is confronted by this information. Our visitors on the audio tour, every guided tour, including student groups. If you bring a group of fourth graders, we will have an age-appropriate, language-appropriate discussion, maybe just for quickly, to reflect on why this country still sends so many people of color to prison. The pattern that goes back to the beginning of actually predates our prison and is actually growing more troubling and more distinct with time. Somewhere along the line, we realized that there is no other museum that's really talking about the American system of prisons and our criminal justice system, and that if there is a national prison museum, that we're it, at least for the time being. And so we've taken this on as part of our sense of what we should be doing, that every aspect of what we communicate with our visitors and all the questions that we ask have to work their way back to the experience of people who are incarcerated today and the systems that we're building for justice in this country. So if we talk about the use of solitary confinement as punishment in the 20th century, then we talk about the use of solitary confinement in prisons today. If we talk about what food was like at Eastern State Penitentiary, we'll talk about what food is like in prisons today. This is one of our more recent pieces. This is Jesse Crimes's extraordinary mural that he made while he was incarcerated in federal prison. He transferred images from the New York Times onto bed sheets using hair gel. He made one giant graph of what this whole piece would look like, but never saw it because he wasn't really supposed to be doing this. And he mailed home sections of this giant mural to himself over the course of 2.5 years, and then only reassembled it when he came home. It's an extraordinary piece. We built a companion piece to that graph in 2016 called Prisons Today, Questions in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And again, we spent a lot of time talking about our audience and who visits Eastern State and where are they coming from and what kind of conversations can we and should we be having with them. And we prototyped the exhibit extensively. I always think it's interesting to look at prototypes that didn't work, and I'll show you one in a minute that did. But we were trying to get visitors in this prototype to identify by race and then see where they fit in their relationship with the justice system of the United States. And predictably, most of our white visitors felt they had no relationship. The piece was meant to illustrate the way that people's interactions with the justice system, with law enforcement, are highly predicted by race. I can't believe we're having this conversation today. And unfortunately, the mechanics of trying to get 500 people a day, which is what the exhibit gets, to go through this experience just never quite worked. Here's a variation on that. I think the US, we had to change it in the middle of the prototype. I think the US criminal justice system works for me. We had to add that too because we found that visitors kept saying it works, but it works in ways that I find upsetting. It works to do what it's doing, but it's harming my community. But again, the mechanics never did make it into the final exhibit. It was just too complicated. But this one did make it in. We found that if we simply divided a corridor and forced visitors to walk on the left or right, whether by identifying whether or not they would admit they'd broken the law, that when we eavesdropped, sometimes museum work is a little creepy. As we eavesdropped on them, we found people having really good conversations as they walked away about when they had gotten away with a crime. And there it is in the exhibit. Have you ever broken the law? We prototyped even the phrasing of that extensively. If you go to the right, we call that the liar's corridor. If you go to the right saying that you've never broken the law, we point out that you're very unusual. Most Americans have done something that would send them to prison. The point of this is to destabilize people's understanding of criminality. Most of us define criminality as having been convicted, but because of everything from enforcement to prosecution to sentencing, there's so much inequity in all of those systems that a fairer definition of criminality obviously is the actual behavior that kicked it off in the beginning. There's another piece of the exhibit called The Criminal Us. This is artist Troy Richards brought this idea to us. Visitors are invited to leave a confession of a time they did break the law. This is what happens if you go to the left. If you admit you broke the law, you get to this, and it asks you to admit the time you broke the law. And then the wall is other confessions left either by people who have broken the law and been caught, or else they're visitors to Eastern State Penitentiary. So half of them were written by people in prison and half were written by visitors to the historic site. And you can't tell which unless you push that button. And so people read them and they try to guess, is this written by someone who was convicted, or is this written by someone like me spending their weekend, their leisure time visiting a prison museum? And it's both, you see people laugh, and then you also see a lot of people get into very deep conversations around this piece of the exhibit. It's one of the most popular parts of the whole exhibit. We wanted to make part of the exhibit about white privilege. Most of our visitors are white, and we wanted to be a social experience where visitors could start conversations about their own childhoods and the factors of their own lives that they've inherited from their parents. And we found that most of our visitors did not like that word privilege. The word privilege was a real conversation ender for most of our visitors. And we found over time that we didn't need it. And so this is sometimes the nature of museum work. We said, do we need to have the word privilege, or can we have this conversation a different way? And so we just cut it out altogether, but we kept prototyping that game. And eventually we got to a part of the exhibit called Early Experiences Matter, where you press buttons and tell the computer what your childhood was like, both, well, including things like your household income or the funding of your school district, but also your race and your exposure to real life violence and trauma. And eventually it'll tell you whether people with childhoods like yours and with placements with families like yours are experiencing high rates of incarceration, normal rates of incarceration, or low rates of incarceration. The exhibit talks about private prisons. It was a very common question among our visitors. And it talks about who can vote in the United States and voter disenfranchisement based on felony convictions. This is one of the most popular parts of the exhibit as well. You see a lot of people taking out their cell phones and photographing that map. The different policies around the country are extraordinary in their breadth, between people being allowed to vote in prison to people being banned for life for any conviction in 12 states in the United States. We had planned to make this exhibit a neutral museum exhibit. I've grown to think there probably is no such thing, but we began saying we're just going to simply provide information and let our visitors draw their own conclusions. And one of our advisors on the development committee said, "Are you really going to tell visitors there's a case for and against the war on drugs?" And I said, "Yes, I guess." And she said, "You really think that you're doing your visitors a service by telling them that there's still active debate over some of these issues?" And she was absolutely right. It took someone from outside the museum field, I think, to really call us on that. But it was really cowardly, or maybe patronizing is a better word, to say there's a case for and against the war on crime in the 1960s or the mandatory minimum sentences. It was just patronizing to say that we didn't have an opinion. Of course you have an opinion. No, we're not ever neutral. And so we opened the exhibit with, again, a graph of the number of people in prison. There it is, 1970. The exhibit's a little more recent than the graph, so it's the 2015 numbers. And we simply compare the rate of violent crime, which is within a percentage point of where we were in 1970. And we state simply that mass incarceration isn't working. The safer communities that we were promised with these policies have not arrived. Mass incarceration is not working, became the thesis. In hindsight, it feels like a pretty timid statement. But for a museum, an historic site, took a lot of discussion with our board to say we're going to really build the exhibit around the idea that there are too many people in American prisons, and the exhibit is about how to find answers other than putting 2.3 million of our fellow citizens behind bars. We had a really active group of advisors for that exhibit, including a group of incarcerated men, they're from men's prison, who were very helpful. And yet we still found ourselves constantly telling the stories of people who weren't in the rooms with us. And our director of education, Lauren Zallet, eventually pushed to begin hiring people who've been incarcerated to work not in behind the scenes elements of our museum, but to work the front lines as educators in our museum. And the same year that we opened that exhibit, we very quietly began hiring people who'd been incarcerated as tour guides. This is Russell Craig giving a tour of our Catholic chaplain's office. The murals were painted in 1955 by a man who was incarcerated and converted to Catholicism while he was incarcerated. Russell would get about halfway through his tour of the space and then take out paintings he'd made while he was incarcerated. And his ability to make that connection to history and to his own life and to put a human face on some of the policies that we talk about was just extraordinary. The people in this program are not required to talk about their own experiences if they're not feeling it that day or if they're not feeling it with that group. But they do have a tool in their toolbox. I should say, incidentally, I have never been incarcerated, so it's not a tool that I have, but it's one that Russell had, and many of our guides in this program moving forward have. This is Josette talking about her conversion to Islam while she was incarcerated. She's standing in our synagogue, but she's talking about her conversion to Islam and the importance of religion to many people who are incarcerated. Hafiz talking about the use of solitary confinement, where he was held for a number of weeks, and he reflects on that with our visitors at our solitary confinement cells. I say we don't talk about this much because when we first started this program, I was very gung-ho. I was very proud that we are second chance employers and wanted to make a logo and put it on our homepage and put a banner in front of the building. And Lauren Zallet, our director of education, who has impeccable ethics and also more common sense, I think, than I had, said, have you thought about how that's going to make our staff feel who've been incarcerated? And honestly, I hadn't given that enough thought. And so we don't trumpet this program, but we've been doing it for years. And I think it's actually the most effective work we do. When it goes well, it goes really, really well. The program, I think that program in particular has inspired our organization to really change our organizational culture, including changing our mission statement. We interpret the legacy of this is new from 2017. We interpret the legacy of American criminal justice reform. I wouldn't use that phrase today, criminal justice, but there it is. From the nation's founding through today in the long abandoned cell blocks of America's most historic prison. So we're still at it. I'll tell you about our most recent project and then tell you where we are with COVID and with Black Lives Matter. We do a landmark flagship project typically every 3 years. The last one was called Lives Illuminated. We spent a full year, after a year and a half of fundraising and hiring staff, we spent a full year teaching a group of artists who are incarcerated how to make films, make animated films. This is like the second day of class. That's one of our animators, Lowell Boston, showing the guys a very early form of animation. And then slowly that's Erica Suia, who's our lead teaching artist. And that's Justino, who's whose wife I just spoke to and whose son is still a close member of the Eastern State family these days. Justino working on his piece. The artist wrote storylines and began animating. This is Quashim writing his piece. Writing his story was about his fight with cancer while incarcerated. Quashim was very much on our mind. He's still incarcerated with a suppressed immune system, which is absolutely terrifying if you're following what's happening in prisons with COVID. What's happening in San Quentin with COVID. It's just unbelievable and so disturbing. So Quashim is very much on our mind. This is Rob and Brahim at the copy stand working on their animation. Jerome, who just came home, working on his piece. Rob, again, that's Christina May. She started off as a voice coach and story coach and became a life coach to all of us on the project. I like to say that's Rob recording his voiceover for his piece. We paid the people in this program. I think that we were the only outside organization that's paid people in the Pennsylvania prison in the last 40 years. And we fought really hard for that. I want to come back to this in a minute. We fought really hard. I was paid for my work on this project. It's important to me that I was paid. And it was very important to us that we paid the artists. I'll come back to that in a minute. We finished the pieces in August of 2017, 20 finished films are about 1.5 minutes each, which doesn't sound like much. 1.5 minutes of animation is a ton of work. And you can really tell a story in 1.5 minutes. We projected the films onto the facade of Eastern State Penitentiary every night for a month. We had about 4,000 people over the course of a month come out to see the films. It was deeply gratifying to see bleachers filled with people every night, including a lot of the families of the filmmakers. It was a constituency we hadn't given a lot of thought to when we started the project, but once we started meeting the artists, we realized that their families were really important members of this whole community that we're trying to build. So we spent a lot of time working with the families and making sure they felt welcome and that they understood that we were trying to help their loved ones tell their stories as well as we could. We projected them projected the films from a coffee shop, and we realized at some point that we had an opportunity to take over the coffee shop and do some programming. That's Erica again on the far right, and William Wallace III, our other teaching artist, on the left. They're giving a presentation, but about their work and working with the guys. But up close, you see people writing these postcards. I'll show you some more photographs of the coffee shop. We did programming every single night. People are looking at cheat sheets so they can figure out the name of the incarcerated filmmaker who made the film that they wanted to write about, and people could write a postcard, fill it out, make a drawing on the front if they wanted to, and then drop it in the mailbox. This was an idea that came late. Damon McCool and our team said, why don't we make these postcards? It's probably 3 weeks before we opened that Damon said we should do this. And we got 875 postcards written to individual filmmakers in this program, incarcerated filmmakers who were not able to see the audience reaction to their pieces, but were able to get stacks and stacks of fan mail from people who'd seen their films and really loved it. Out of 875, we had 2 negative postcards. Unfortunately, we destroyed those before we really had a thought about what to do with them. If I could do it again, I would have brought those in as well into the prison. I think that the guys didn't need to be protected from that. We had a final meeting, semi-final meeting of the group at the end of the project. And we talked about what went well and what didn't. I'm confident that every person in this group, every single person finished a film. We didn't have any dropouts. After a year of very tedious animation, every person finished a film. And after we left, it occurred to me that a 2-hour conversation, including a lot of chances for anonymous feedback from the group, we got some constructive criticism. Mostly it was extremely positive. And no one mentioned that we paid them, which I've been reflecting on a lot recently, that we were so proud of that and worked so hard to do it. And I think it might have been, in the end, more important to us than it was to them. It's hard to know, but it was not something that turned up in their reasons that they were glad they were part of the program. I really encourage you to watch the films. I considered showing one tonight, but you can do it yourself. Hiddenlives.org. Watch all the films. There are 20 of them. There's not a single weak film in that entire stack. They're all excellent. In March of 2020, we closed. Like all museums worldwide, we had to close. And we're a museum that operates on largely earned revenue. So this has been a financial disaster for us. We've actually had to lay off staff. It was the last possible resort, but we did lay off staff. I want to acknowledge that we did that in August. We did eventually reopen the site. We're open for highly reduced tours, but we do have some tours today. During the time we were closed, though, we took our monthly speaker series. We have a speaker series a little bit like this, actually, where we bring in a guest once a month. We went to weekly, and we continued to do it live. I went every Tuesday night to Eastern State Penitentiary by myself in the middle of an abandoned building, in the middle of what felt like an abandoned city. And we had callers and guests from around the country, and every one of those for 11 weeks in a row was about the impact of COVID-19 to people who are incarcerated. It sounds like it would get repetitive. We kept thinking that eventually we would move on to another topic, but there's so many ways in which that disease and the response of our justice systems and our prison systems, everything from statistical analysis to hearing voices of people from inside to artwork inspired by the pandemic coming from inside prisons. Did that for 11 weeks in a row until we finally reopened the site. We've gone back to monthly, but we still are having our monthly series. And we still have twice a week, actually this is now once a week, a 3-minute vlog about the news stories from that week, about prisons and the pandemic, about the way that disease is impacting people who are incarcerated, who are highly, highly vulnerable. I'll get off the soapbox in a minute, but this is a pattern that goes back in history. It was typhoid, and then it was tuberculosis, and then it was Spanish flu, and today it's COVID. But people who are incarcerated are highly at risk for disease, and this is a pattern we see again and again. Anyway, we have now it's once a week podcast, a video podcast that you can watch. More than one of those episodes has been about San Quentin, so I know that's a topic close to your hearts as well. We always start off every one of those talking about the impact of COVID in prisons. The red line is the incarceration rate, which by all accounts is not well reported, but for the numbers that we have, it's over 100,000. This work is coming out of UCLA, by the way, another California reference for this audience. But that line is clearly nowhere close to being flattened, that curve. I said that we don't do everything perfectly. The dirty secret of Eastern State is we've been paying for a lot of this programming over the years by running a haunted house. In 2020, the virus has made, social distancing has made running a haunted house basically impossible anyway. And so I don't want to paint us as having taken that principle to the stand, because the model of a haunted house is very high numbers of people, but many of us had grown very uncomfortable with running a haunted house anyway. We'd removed all references to modern prisons, or almost all references to modern prisons, from the haunted house in the past couple of years. Certainly anyone in prison costume had been removed. But we were still running costumed entertainment up till 2019. In 2020, we have switched to what we're calling simply night tours, which is our daytime programming at night. So visitors can come in, again, with social distancing. There were not too many visitors anyway, and they can experience the site in the darkness, including there's people out on our graph experiencing and confronting those statistics, and our hidden lives films. So we're projecting those. It's like seeing an old friend. Well, it's like it is literally seeing some old friends. We've been projecting those hidden Lives Illuminated films, this time on the inside of the walls, again, during night tours. I am happy to take any questions or respond to any thoughts. In 2020, it's and particularly today, or in the last week with what's happening in our country, these topics are obviously very difficult. I should have warned people at the start of this that some of these topics obviously can be very disturbing. So thank you for bearing with me, and I look forward to talking more. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take any questions if anyone has them.
Sean, thank you so much for such an important and inspiring talk at a moment when everyone really needs to be inspired. We really appreciate your teaching us just how museums can be self-reflexive and transparent in exposing these injustices and looking at, self-reflexively at the museum's role and mistakes that museums make. So we have a number of questions coming in. One from a current student, Kayleen, who you'll meet in class next week, asks how you handle the internal pushback when the museum transitioned to become more self-reflexive and look at your own role in this narrative on justice and prisons.
We didn't do it particularly well. I had the people that I thought would present resistance, I had exactly wrong. I thought it'd be our visitors, I thought it'd be our funders, I thought it'd be our board of directors. All of those groups were great. It unified our board around a common mission. Our visitorship has continued to grow. We've actually gotten a lot of interest from funders. But I was unprepared. Kayleen, you're obviously ahead of me. I was unprepared for the resistance that we would get from our frontline staff in particular. And they were right. We had a group of people we had hired to give fairly traditional historic tours, and know largely about architecture or about people's lives, but people's lives from up until 1971. But one day we built that graph. And so one day the graph wasn't there, the next day it was. And suddenly they had to talk about race in America, race and the justice system with total strangers all day long. And a lot of them said, I wasn't hired for this. I wasn't trained for this. And sometimes I think this pattern must be true of every place that tries to undergo the kind of a change, but just maybe the percentages are different. But if you imagine a pie chart, I would say half of our frontline staff said, sure, I'll go along with this. And I would say a quarter of them were frustrated we weren't already doing it and had been pushing for it. And that presented some challenges in itself, but they were right. And there was about a quarter of our staff that was dead set against it. And I've had this discussion a lot with colleagues about what to do in that moment. A colleague I respect deeply said, eventually I just said, we're doing this. Like we gave a full year to ramp up to it, but a year out, we knew we were going to build that graph. And eventually we just said, we are doing this, And a colleague I respect very much said, that's really irresponsible to send people out to talk about subjects that they're not comfortable talking about. But I would push back and say that if we'd waited for every last one of our guides to say they were ready to talk about these things, we would still be waiting. And so one of our guides quit very, very publicly, about as public a way as he could. And another one we fired. And I don't know what else to say about that, but at some point, I believe that you have to say, this is the direction we're going, and this is the new direction, and we can provide you. We gave our team a full year, but we had to move on. Today, people who join our staff at Eastern State typically are there because they want to talk about these things, but it was a huge challenge. I wish I could go back in time and redo a lot of those things. And Lauren Zallett, for those of you who are in the program, you can Google her. She's written about this quite a bit. She walks on water. She's extraordinary. But she ran that program, and she would agree that that we really should have given that more thought and shouldn't have been surprised.
Change is hard, indeed.
Change is hard.
Yeah. Another attendee is wondering if you can tell us a bit about what incarcerated people are given during COVID-19 in terms of protections, what the living conditions, how they've changed during the pandemic.
I feel a little uncomfortable trying to answer that because I'm a museum person, and we, of course we summarize this. I can tell you that the general, well, there's 50 states. Every state has its own system. Most people who are incarcerated in the United States are in state prisons. And so the vast bulk of people are in state prisons who are incarcerated at any given moment. And there are 50 different systems, and they're all different. The Pennsylvania system has actually done, I should not say that. The Pennsylvania system has done a good job, not perfect, but a good job of providing PPE and training for the staff. And the infection rates in Pennsylvania prisons are pretty low, but every state also has counties, and every county has a prison. And so in Pennsylvania, we have several counties with terrible incarceration rates. Some of the most troubling stories I've ever heard that are from this period, and we're obviously living through an historic moment, come out of San Quentin and come out of the California system. I suspect I don't need to tell you that, being that you're right there, but California made some horrific choices in how they responded in the early days to this pandemic. So I think in general, it's safe to say that people in prison today do have PPE and they have hand sanitizer, but once the viruses get into these prisons, it's very hard to obviously quarantine and get them back out. But it's not I'm not a true expert on that subject.
Thank you. Another question from Michael Kinamoto. Have you been able to engage visitors across our deep political divide? And have you been surprised by any reactions to the exhibits, like the three-dimensional bar graph?
We try to bridge that political divide, and it just gets harder and harder and harder. But we are a big tent organization. We believe in a dialogic approach, and the nature of dialogue is that it requires generous listening. And so we try to spend a lot of time asking our visitors for their feelings and opinions and genuinely listen to it and listen to their opinions. And it is hard work. And it's hardest on our frontline staff that's out there all day long listening to things that sometimes can feel like they're veiled racist comments. And what do you say when someone makes a joke about don't drop the soap? I mean, that's, in our world, that's a joke about rape. That isn't, but you have to have some response ready for that. And, you know, we talk a lot about trying to find ways to end conversations, to start conversations, not end them. You know, what do you say in that moment that doesn't just shut the conversation down? We do have a set of non-negotiables for our frontline staff that they don't have to get into conversations about whether certain racial groups are inherently criminal. You know, it is self-evident to us that the racial disparity in our prisons are a result of policy. And so we are about hosting conversations about policy moving forward that could reduce the number of people in prison and particularly reduce those racial disparities. It gets harder and harder. I remain committed to it. It is extremely difficult. We have had great moments of bridging the political divide. So I could, you know, there's this thing that we all do when we get behind a PowerPoint, and I call it like the sort of the PowerPoint moment where you can say, here's this quote of someone who wrote in and said this thing. And so I could show you several of those of people who said they really have reconsidered their thoughts about the number of people we put in prison. And so we've had those moments. But the truth is there are a lot of moments there are people we just can't, who we haven't reached, or people who don't take it seriously. And we've had those challenges as well. I think that people who have experienced incarceration have a tool that is particularly powerful in bridging that divide, but it's also a particularly heavy ask to ask someone to go out and have a conversation like that. We never ask someone to do that against their will. The ethics of that program, by the way, are absolutely are fluid, and I can see that, you know, there are times when we wonder if we do the right thing by even creating a program like that. But we don't ask people to go out and have those conversations if they don't want to. But the moments I've really seen people appear to go through some deep change, or some deep change, at least in perspective, has often been when they talk to someone who's formerly incarcerated. Because our nation, for very good reasons, people who are formerly incarcerated rarely talk about it. And so most people think they've never met someone who's been incarcerated. We are all surrounded by people who are formerly incarcerated. 600,000 people a year coming home from our prisons. But it's not a topic that most people are encouraged to. I should speak for myself. In my community, obviously I'm white and never been incarcerated. It's not a topic that people talk about very much. And so people who have been incarcerated tend to keep quiet about it. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'll say one more quick anecdote. 4 years ago, I was just chatting with a couple of tour guides in front of Al Capone's cell. And Al Capone was incarcerated at Eastern State briefly. And one of the guides said, I wish I had a nickel for every time I heard someone say, I wonder if Hillary Clinton's cell is going to look like that. And I said, no, come on, like, seriously, how many times have you actually heard that? Like 4 times or 5 times? I said, no. And all of them said, oh, we hear it every day. And I thought, what would it take to look at a cell in an abandoned prison and make the series of logical jumps that what you jump to is Hillary Clinton? And I just didn't see what we all know now was coming. But we've been talking a lot about how to support our staff now. Because of COVID, actually our staff interactions with our visitors are fairly limited anyway. And God help me for even thinking this, but perhaps it's a blessing. But I don't know what would be happening if we were really deeply engaging in the contents there on the audio players, on the exhibits, but we don't host deep conversations on site at length right now because of social distancing. So we are trying and we're committed to it, but it just keeps getting harder.
Thank you. We do have many more interesting questions. So Hannah Franken writes, have you explored or had any exhibits regarding gender and incarceration, specifically trans and non-binary folks?
Yes, we have an exhibit on view right now. It's an art installation from 2009. So before we really got both our feet into hosting these discussions with our staff, we were, as I mentioned earlier, commissioning artwork on these subjects. And an artist I can pull up, that's all right. An artist named Michelle Handelman made a piece for us called Beware the Lily Law. That's about the experience of trans people in American prisons, which you might guess is generally horrific. So she researched the cases of 3 real people and then hired actors to portray them, and then filmed those actors against a black screen. And then her piece is a video installation where she projects those performances onto the wall of one of the cells. And it's very eerie because they're projected at life size with a really nice high quality sound system. And you really do get the sense you're in the cell with a person telling you these stories. And so it's been on view since 2009. And we every so often talk about taking it off view because it's been on view for so long, although most of our visitors are first time visitors. But the topic is just so important that it's been on view for, it remains on view right now. It was on view today. But we don't say much about it in our actual Eastern State Museum voice. And so that is something that it's on the list of subjects that we have not addressed and that we need to. We say very little about juvenile justice. We say very little about psychiatric health. And so it's on that list of things that we need to begin addressing.
Great, thank you. Another attendee writes, Sean, could you speak to the current effort to provide voting and voting info at your site in the upcoming election?
I would be happy to. It's a topic very close to my heart. We have been registering people to vote on our property for about 2.5, 3 years, all day, every day in 2 different locations. Actually, right now with COVID, it's only in 1 location. And it's been really interesting to me to see the pushback that we've gotten. We've gotten very little pushback, but we did get pushback from a Pennsylvania state representative. So in the Pennsylvania legislature, one of those legislators came to Eastern State and saw that we had a voter registration station and wrote actually to our lobbyist, again, the ugly underbelly of museums. But we do have a lobbyist, and he heard from this rep saying that, don't you think you're endangering your tax exempt status? And the 501c3 status explicitly names nonpartisan voter registration as one of the justifications for getting a tax exempt status for your organization. And the fact that so many people have come to believe that it could be a political thing to do, a partisan, I think we need to distinguish between political and partisan, that partisan can and is and should be off the table for tax exempt organizations. But how do you not talk about politics? I mean, how do you, that's just completely, not talking about politics is talking about politics. When we built that graph, actually, the graph originally didn't have, sorry, that's a digression. I'll get back to that in a second. So we register people to vote every day. We get a couple people a week. Last year, I think it was 250 people. This year, in election year, we've had more originally, but then of course we've been closed. I think our total is, I know our total is up over 600 people we've registered to vote to date. I don't understand why more museums don't do it. It's the strangest thing in the world to me. We wanted to become a polling place this year too. We weren't able to make that work, but the idea that supporting the democratic process is a partisan act is just repugnant. I don't know how we got here, but it's really disturbing. My quick aside a minute ago was that not talking about how policy gets made, which is through the political process, not talking about that is talking about it. When we built that graph, we were originally not going to address race on it because the graph doesn't show you the general population. You don't see the disparity between the prison population and the general population. You just see the prison population. And so people look at it sometimes and they'll say, well, 40% Black, our prison population today is 40% Black. That looks about right. And it's deeply wrong. Our general population is 13% Black. But we found that we really needed to make a statement that forced every visitor to confront those statistics, even if it was an imperfect way. And one of our staff members said at one point, I said, we're not doing a great job talking about race. This was years ago. I think we still needed to be doing much more. But she said, oh, we talk about race every day. Our silence on the subject tells our visitors exactly how important we think it is. So if we don't talk about these things, it's still a form of, it's still a statement. Silence is a very powerful statement. So I think if we don't talk about how policy gets made, if we don't register voters, then I think that we are choosing to sit out a role in our communities that's critical, and our democracy could use all the help it could get right now.
Thank
That's my
you.
soapbox. I'll get off now.
So inspiring and so important. And I agree, more museums should become polling places and registering voters. So we have a number of architecture students listening in this evening, and one of them wonders what inspired prisons to adopt the wagon wheel design, and related, was Eastern State Penitentiary the first prison built in this formation?
Historic sites, always, no answer is ever easy. At an historic site, there's never like a clean, crisp answer. So there were a couple of small jails in England that were built on a wagon wheel floor plan that predate Eastern State. But the architect that built Eastern State Penitentiary, his name was John Haviland, popularized that model. He took something that people were experimenting with in England and made a full-scale, well, Eastern State Penitentiary was the most expensive prison in the world when it was built, arguably the most influential prison to this day ever built. And so he took that and built it out onto a grand scale. And today there are hundreds of prisons modeled on Eastern State with that wagon wheel floor plan. So it wasn't the first, but it was the one that everyone copied. And the other part of that question was, forgive me, Paula, was it the first? And
What inspired that particular style?
It was inspired by prisons in England, and it was designed for ventilation, and it was designed for efficiency to be able to get out to the various parts of the building quickly. You know, Paris is designed this way to suppress riots, that there's a central control point and then these huge avenues that go out. And then these old prisons were designed with the same idea, that you could get anywhere in the prison quickly if it's built on that design.
And related, another student asks, what are some deciding factors that allow an architect to decide whether or not to design a prison? So are there ethical issues that come up?
I don't know if the question is coming from the recent debate. It's not that recent, an ongoing debate in the American Institute of Architects, AIA. The San Francisco chapter put forward a proposal that the AIA forbid architects from designing solitary confinement cells or death chambers. And it's been something that I've found interesting for years. I actually wrote about this years back, and I've been surprised. I love architecture, and some of my closest friends are architects, and you know, sort of live and breathe the stuff with the work that we do at Eastern State. But I've been surprised how few architects have thought that was even a question that was worth considering. It seemed to me to be kind of self-evident. It also seemed like a very easy thing to do. Why can't you just say, I mean, how many death chambers get designed in a year anyway? I mean, there's only 50 states, and more than half of them don't even practice capital punishment. It seems like it would be more of a symbolic moment, but it has not taken any, it's been absolutely dead, I think, until the Black Lives Matter protest started. And then Michael Kimmelman in the New York Times, who had written an article 5 or 6 years ago saying that this is an overdue moment for AIA, wrote another article this summer, more pointedly saying, why will the AIA not take this issue up? And I'm hoping that they do. It is symbolic. I think that, with all due respect to architects, and my architect friends hate when I say this, the defining characteristics of a prison, I mean, buildings can certainly make people unhappy, and they can support healthy programs, and they can support healthy life, but so much of what happens in prisons happen in rooms that are much like any other room. And the questions are, how did the person get confined in that room in the first place? Who sent them there? What kind of programs are available in that room? What are the conditions of what kind of food? What sort of educational opportunities? What are their options to get out? How long are they going to be held there? who hired the staff that was going to oversee them in that room, and how's that staff supervised. These are, in my view, far more impactful in the overall effectiveness and experience of prisons than the physical shape of the building. Architects have, and again, I'm sorry to keep beating up on architects. Architects have a kind of a bad history of looking at complex human situations and complex social challenges and trying to design a solution from behind a drafting table, but without the people who built prisons for many years didn't spend a lot of time going into prisons. I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so, I think that architects who work in prisons, obviously, it seems self-evident when you say it, need to start by going into prisons and spending a lot of time with people who live there and people who work there. But that's just my opinion. I don't know if there's any kind of an accreditation process that's required to design a prison. There are architecture firms that specialize in it, but sorry for I've been going on one soapbox after another. Forgive me. It's been it's been that kind of a summer where a lot of these issues are close to many of our hearts. So, and I deeply respect the field of architecture, and I hope I don't come across as being dismissive of it.
No, thank you. Very helpful. So this next question relates to this reckoning happening in museums regarding the whole internal structure of the museum. And this attendee asks, will the museum continue to offer more employment to formerly incarcerated individuals and people of color, especially in positions of power? I notice there is not much diversity or voices from incarcerated individuals on the board of directors.
Well, it may not be obvious, but one of our members of our board of directors actually is formerly incarcerated. But it is definitely a challenge. Our board of directors is actually, I think, has greater racial diversity than our leadership team on the staff. It's definitely a weakness of the organization that is undeniable. And so we have created some positions in our leadership team. We have, yes, we are absolutely going to continue hiring people who are formerly incarcerated. We have a grant from IMLS. I never know how to say this exactly, but the man who was running our program of formerly incarcerated people actually died this summer of COVID-19. So the whole program is kind of in this moment of trying to look at who we want to be after this moment and try to rebuild ourselves in a better model. But the critique is absolutely fair, that especially on our staff, at the leadership level, we are a group of mostly white people. And so it's a fair critique. And I think that museums who aren't asking themselves these questions right now, I think most museums, I hope, are asking themselves these questions right now.
Absolutely, thank you. Couple of questions about the visitors. So once the museum kind of owned that we are not neutral, did that diversify the visitor demographics? And then a related question, in terms of the white visitors not liking the term white privilege, did they still participate, and has it worked reaching an audience that might disagree with such terms?
I mean, obviously it's not everybody, but we think that, that particular experience, that early experiences matter interactive does seem to, we did a summative evaluation where we studied how people move through that exhibit, but we don't have a way of tracking people by race. So among our visitors. And so we do think that several of our exhibit elements are reaching white audiences fairly effectively, but it's hard to know. Our audience has been slowly becoming more racially diverse over time, but our audience is so heavily tourists that it is still a majority white audience, for sure. And so we are working very hard to try to attract more local audiences and try to reach out. Where we do see far greater racial diversity in our audience is in our group tours and our education programs. And so we bring, last year's, I forget the exact number of students, thousands and thousands of students through the site every year. And a lot of those groups now come to Eastern State because they want to have conversations about race and the justice system, about what are prisons for, what do prisons do, what is mass incarceration. So we do see a lot of interest from the Philadelphia audience among teachers and students from the college level down to 3rd and 4th grade who bring the class to Eastern State to have these conversations. But our walk-in audience is still mostly tourists, and they are mostly white.
Thank you. We have a question here from Stephen Tulsky on the faculty at USF. Do you have a sense of where your museum stands as a visitor draw in your area as compared to alternative museum options? Are you seen as a specialty interest or a must-see? What percentage of the residents of your area have been to visit, approximately?
Well, let's see. We are one of the most popular attractions in Philadelphia. So if you look at raw attendance numbers, we had 310,000 visitors last year. So the Philadelphia Museum of Art gets about 700,000. So we're about half of that. The Liberty Bell here in Philadelphia gets about 1 million. So we're in that top handful of museums, not the most popular, but we're getting there. Most of our visitors are tourists. And so a lot of people from Philadelphia haven't been. We're relatively new. And so slowly every year that goes by, of course, there are more people who come. But we are slowly getting more Philadelphians to know who we are. But one of the natures of museums is it's difficult to get people to do things in their backyard. And so we have this conversation endlessly about how to get more of our local audience to come out to the prison when so many of us visit other places when we travel, but when we're at home, there's always you can always put off for another week. And so, percentage of local audiences that have been to Eastern State, I don't know. I just don't know the answer to that. I just don't know. I'm sorry.
Thank you. A question came in about private prisons and how does the museum acknowledge them? Can the stories of state and federal prisons be assumed of private prisons?
We do talk a little bit about private prisons. We'll be talking more about them next year, but we have some elements of our exhibit are about private prisons. Most people held in private prisons in the United States are held in federal prisons. And so one of the things we found in talking with our audience is that many people in our audience overestimated the number of people held in private prisons in the United States. It's actually a relatively low number. And then dramatically underestimated how much commercial interest there is in running our so-called public prisons. So when you pull into a parking lot of a prison, I could never figure this out until the last couple of years. You pull into the parking lot of a prison and it's just filled with all these contractor vans. And those buildings that are not considered private prisons are run by so many aspects of how it's run are run by private industry. So from food service to healthcare to janitorial services to IT to facilities management. It's like there are so many interests in keeping our prison system running the way that it is that go beyond private prisons, and that there's private industry all through the so-called publicly run prisons. And so we talk about that in our exhibit, and we sort of compare some of those numbers. Next year, we're going to have an artist. One of our artist installations for next year is going to be building a piece about immigration detention. And that's another place where will give us an opportunity to talk about private prisons, because so much of the immigration detention in this country is run privately. So I'm looking forward to being able to engage with some of those questions with our visitors as well.
That's great. I think there's a lot of interest in our community also about the role of art in this dialogue. And Isabel Tayag writes, what makes art, films, and museums uniquely powerful, engaging the mind and altering people's perceptions of incarceration, crime, and justice?
What makes museum, can you read that one more time, Paula? Just want to make sure I got this.
What makes art, film, and museums? So the role, I think, of visual art and film in the museum setting, a powerful way to change people's perceptions on this topic.
Well, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that that artists, we often kind of try to reverse engineer the success that artists were having in connecting with our visitors as we tried to build our museum programming. And you know, there are advantages and disadvantages of traditional museum programming. And one of the, something that cuts both ways is that when you build an exhibit or an audio tour, hang a sign on a wall, people are less inclined to question it. And so, you know, you put up a sign that says, this is cell block 7, constructed in 1836 on a model of John Haviland, copied, and people just don't think to question that, because as a museum person, I know that so often those signs can be riddled with mistakes or bias, but it just doesn't feel, it feels so polished. But it also is a very cold experience. And it's like the visitor's here and the object is there. And there's this intermediary that's this, what feels like a very neutral, we know that it's not, but a very neutral voice, a very polished graphic designer, audio engineer interface. And artists could say, you know, this is what a Guantanamo Bay cell looks like inside of an Eastern State Penitentiary cell. If we'd done that ourselves, it would have been so distracting, because it's such a personal vision of trying to put one inside the other. It just would have been such a strange thing to do, even if we had thought to do it. But artists have been able to make this connection. And then particularly when people can speak about their experiences with incarceration, I think it's just self-evident that is letting people, the creative process of music and stories, and in our case, filmmaking, just opens people up to kind of shut down this critical thinking of, people have opinions about justice that they think they've had forever. You know, people don't revisit these opinions. Most of us don't revisit these opinions after college, you know? And so to get people to like just stop and just listen, and stop and just be open to the humanity of the story that you're hearing, of the song you're hearing, of the film you're watching. I think it's, traditional museum work doesn't necessarily lend itself to really cutting through and saying, there's a human being on the other side of this, who might have something really interesting or thought-provoking for you to experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
great. I think that art is really, you know, plays such a powerful role in changing these messages. So it's wonderful that you're able to, you know, work with so many people within the prison who are making art to express the situation. So I'm wondering personally if you can address kind of what has been the most rewarding aspect of this work and engagement with this subject, and how has it changed your life? It's really been your life's work, and how has it changed it?
The most rewarding, one of our advisors from that exhibit, who's very influential in that exhibit, who was incarcerated, when he came home, we hired him into our leadership team, and he helped hire and support all of our educators, including those who'd been formerly incarcerated. So his name was Reem, and you know, he and I were fairly close. He's the gentleman I mentioned who died over the summer. So also one of the more painful things. But I think I would have to say that being able to work side by side with Reem, he and I sat outside and watched the opening night of those films together on the bleachers, and I never thought he was going to come home. You know, a lot of people who are in prison, it seems like they're going to come home sooner than they do. It seems like when all the barriers are gone, they still sit there for a couple of years. And so when Reem finally came home, and he and I went to the same university, and just a lot of things about our lives that overlapped. So that was wonderfully gratifying. You know, when I was able to work with him, I think bringing those postcards into the prison, when our audience for the Hidden Lives Illuminated films wrote postcards to the filmmakers, and then we were able to deliver those postcards, that was enormously gratifying. That was great. And it has changed my life. I don't even know what else to say about it. I was a fairly traditional museum person coming into this. And I think that, you know, Brian Stevenson, who's a civil rights attorney, activist, talks about proximity. It's sort of a really grotesque element of COVID-19, that literally proximity is difficult now, that literal proximity is difficult, but getting to spend time with so many wonderful people who are coming home or have been incarcerated, or even people who are currently incarcerated, has been really great. One of the filmmakers for Hidden Lives was up for commutation and asked me to support him in his commutation, which I did, which was also enormously gratifying. One of our advisors for the exhibit asked me to, everyone applying for commutation in Pennsylvania gets one single advocate who's allowed to speak at their hearing. And one of our advisors asked me to be his advocate at the hearing. For complicated reasons, I was actually not able to speak at his hearing. They had technical problems, and I wasn't actually able to speak, and he's actually appealing his case. He was also denied. He's appealing his case on the grounds that his advocate wasn't able to speak for him. But these relationships, I think, have become so meaningful to many of us on the staff that it's kind of hard to imagine, hard to remember what it was like before, honestly.
And last question, I'm wondering if you have words of advice for all of our emerging museum professionals and architects and others listening tonight, in terms of really exposing the realities of what's happening, giving messages that don't necessarily want to be heard. What is your advice in doing this kind of work based on some of the struggles that you've faced in your own work?
When Glory first approached me about being here tonight, I wasn't sure that I wanted to do it. And she and I talked very bluntly about it for a while. And I don't feel, you've been very generous to invite me here, and for folks on this call, I mean, thank you so much for listening to this conversation. But I feel so uncomfortable right now giving advice. I feel like it's really a time that people in museums need to spend learning. So I feel like delivering a final piece of advice just doesn't feel quite right this minute. I'm trying to be in a real learning mode in 2020 and spending more time trying to reflect on what we're doing, what we should be doing better, why we've made progress that isn't fast enough in some areas. So I'm not sure I'm comfortable giving one final piece of advice. Things are changing so quickly in museums. A lot of this change has been a long time coming. And I'm not sure where it's leading our organization or how I'm going to feel about it a year from now. And so I'm going to kind of politely, I hope, demur. I'm not sure if I have one final nugget of wisdom. I can literally still hear helicopters over my head for protests happening 5 blocks from here. And I just don't, I don't know. I'm very humbled by the invitation to speak. I'm humbled by the request, but I'm going to pass on that last question, if that's okay.
Of course. Well, just being with you here this evening has been, so meaningful for all of us as we're grappling with this world that we're living in that seems to, be crumbling. So I think what you've done is bring so much hope And we can only keep doing the work and getting out the vote. And, you know, we really are grateful for your sharing your story and your museum story and how you've affected change. So thank you so much, Sean, for spending time with us this evening and sharing the whole story. And we're so grateful to the Thacher Gallery for co-hosting with the Museum Studies program. Thank you, Glory and Victoria and Nell, for getting us all set up so beautifully this evening. Thanks to all the students and faculty and community that have come and joined us. And we're so grateful, Sean, to learn with you and from you this evening. So thank you all.
Thank you. I have a final, maybe I should, I'm afraid that if we end this, I'm gonna lose the chance to read all the comments in the Q&A and just, I don't have particularly great eyesight. And so you've been very kind, Paula, to read them. But I wonder if you could save them. I just at a glance, I already see some comments. I would love just to read these over. So before you close, I'm not sure if they'll be saved in the recording or not, but I would love to have a chance to reflect. Just one comment in particular, I just glanced at that I thought I'd love to spend a minute reflecting, especially since I'll be meeting with your students next week.
Absolutely, we can save everything. So.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much again. Thanks to the university and to Gloria and to you, Paula, and to Nell and Victoria. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night from Philadelphia.